Welcome to the FMCG Guys podcast. I'm your co-host, Daniel Torres. Hi, Efrain. Good to see you.
Hi, Daniel. Good to be here as always.
So, Efrain, the headwinds in international diplomacy. We're hearing a lot about tensions in the world today, which is, I'm saying it with a smile, but I shouldn't. And these are not only making headlines, but they're actually creating disruptions to global businesses. I don't know. How are you seeing this affect businesses today, Efrain?
Well, I mean, without getting into the specifics of it, I would say that, a lot of brands, given some of the political unrest that you're referring to, have had to rethink not just where they distribute and sell their products, but also in terms of like talent and organizational design as well, right? In terms of being able to think about, if you had teams that were in an area of unrest, are you having to rethink, do you have those same people on site, or do you have to, really, in essence, reposition those teams to other markets instead? That doesn't even get into, like, for example, thinking about where you're sourcing your actual product from as well. Yep. So if you're in a situation where your product comes from a particular part of the world, and that market tends to become less available to access, that's an issue in and of itself as well. So lots of things for marketers to think about, for sure.
Yeah, well, if marketers are thinking about it, imagine our tax and logistic departments. Tell me.
No. I'm laughing just because, those are those hard conversations that I think those of us in marketing need a lot of people in our legal teams and our tax teams and our compliance teams to kind of make sure that they walk us through, because it's not something that we do every day.
Yeah, exactly. So within these complexities, there's a department that's starting to occupy, or if it's not starting to occupy in your company, it should start to occupy a key role. This department helps companies navigate the complexities of tariff agreements, trade wars, duties, and sometimes even leverages them as a competitive advantage. We're speaking, of course, of the so-called trade compliance department, which is sometimes also combined with customs. And to speak about this, I'm very happy to say that our podcast guest today is Bruna Romano. She's heading up trade compliance at PUMA, and I actually placed Bruna at PUMA back in the day. So I'm very keen to have her finally on the podcast and understand how she sees the trade conflicts in the world and how she's governing this function at PUMA.
My name is Bruna Romano. I'm the head of Global Customs and Trade Compliance at PUMA. So I'm basically in charge of a small team, but we give the standards and we give the rules for all the subsidiaries and the headquarters of people doing inbound, bringing goods in, and everyone managing the supply chain, this movement of goods coming in and out of the countries.
So, Bruna, it's great to have you on. And as we were discussing prior to the podcast, this is a topic that I admittedly don't know as much about as I should. So, I guess just to ask the initial question, can you tell myself, but also I guess for part of our audience, how would you define trade compliance? What is trade compliance?
It's not easy to define, but I will try. It's just, I think, a set of rules. It's part of the compliance itself, the corporate compliance, that ensures that all the activities related to international trade, so the movement of goods of cross borders, they are followed. So there are, of course, applicable laws and regulations, and these relate not only to the national legislations, so national governments, but also to international organizations such as the EU, the WCO, the World Customs Organization, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So we need to make sure that these rules are followed, they are respected. And this is mainly the regulation part. But some topics that are dealt with in trade compliance are import and export control, the trade sanctions and embargoes, customs regulations. When we talk about customs regulations, we talk about free trade agreements, the rules of origin that are inside the free trade agreements, the classification of goods. So when we talk about harmonized system, the tariff, which is the EU harmonized system, this is the classification of goods, customs valuation, which is the amount that you need to pay to customs, the amount of duties you need to pay to customs when you cross border. This follows a certain rules, and this is the customs valuation, the value that we give to goods when you cross border.
Yeah, and I imagine, I remember seeing this in some of the marketing textbooks that I've used in my past, and this is definitely an area that I think a lot of marketers would benefit from having a better understanding on. So that's great for you to kind of, in essence, lay it out that way, which is that it's the standards and rules across the system of whatever company you work in that facilitates the international movement of goods, right? And like I said, I think it's definitely something that a lot of us in marketing could certainly stand to improve our understanding on.
Yeah, that's true. It's an area that not all the companies really understand. Some of them give this to external consultants. Some of them leave to tax people to deal with it, because in the end you pay duties, import duties and VAT, so import VAT. So they believe it sits a bit in VAT. Some people leave it to the compliance people in legal to deal with the embargoes and the export controls, which is also okay, but it's a piece of it as well. But you miss the full picture in the end, because you could have cost savings. You need experts to classify the goods correctly, to see if there are benefits on the free trade agreements. You could have paid maybe less duties if you applied those correctly, if you teach your factories or your suppliers how to use the rules of origin correctly. So there's a lot of things connected when you think of trade compliance, or even to stop your goods from being stopped at the border, because today there are so many trade wars and barriers to trade out there because of this protectionism, and there are a lot of risks of having your supply chain completely blocked at certain markets. So market access is a big deal, and companies maybe don't realize that today if they don't have a person from trade compliance on board.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to lay like the ground of like all the different topics that I think will be interesting to talk about. And but before that, Bruna, I wanted to ask you, because I don't think many kids grow up saying they want to be a head of trade compliance, even if it's at PUMA, which is a very cool brand. How did you end up in trade compliance? Because I know that you obviously, I think you studied to be a lawyer, but then you ended up in trade compliance. How did that happen?
Yeah, that's true, and it's a very good question, actually, because you're right. Nobody, I think, dreams of being someone who does trade compliance, and for me, it was just by case. It was yes, as you said, I'm a lawyer. I started with commercial law, contracts. Then I went to tax law, which is something I really liked at university. I even had. I was part of a teaching program at university with tax law. And then when I moved to Italy, I'm originally Brazilian. My father is Italian, so I have a piece of family that's still a big part of my family is still in Italy. When I went to Italy, I got a job in KPMG in the consulting part, the legal part. And I spoke already English at the time, and they said, well, we need someone that speaks English at the trade team, the customs and trade team would you like to try that? And I said, well, of course, it's something new. And I had no idea what it was.
Wow.
This was back in 2006. And since then, I really enjoyed it. I started learning and having multiple clients, different clients from different industries. And I never left customs and trade.
Yeah. And I guess in some way it was a good thing that you started it in consulting as well, no? Because you get to see a lot of different types of companies. You can establish like a lot of benchmarks of what good looks like, no?
It was really good. And I think it was also very good that I even moved between consulting firms, and in between I also moved back to Brazil, because the way that markets see trade compliance is also different. In Europe, it's very much on the theory and the application of the customs code. So it's the customs regimes, it's very much on how you do with the AEO and all the benefits. When I moved to Brazil, of course, it's on tax saving, because Latin America is a lot on collecting taxes. So the tax part, Brazil, for example, has 4 different import VATs. So besides of the import duties, you also have different import VATs. So a lot of what we did in consulting in Brazil is modeling in Excel how much the company, if it's an international company going to Brazil, how much is the cost of the operation going to be in the end for the consumer, and all the layers in between that you need to do to calculate, so they understand, well, is it better to import through São Paulo or through Santa Catarina or through the north? And the state taxes are different in Brazil, so the tax system is very complicated. So in each of these markets, the way you see trade compliance and the requirements and the aim of the authorities is different. So this was really good for me to understand from one to the other, what are the nuances in trade and how to calculate and what to pay attention to.
Mm. So, Bruna, and you've already alluded to this in some of your other earlier responses, but obviously trade compliance sounds like it's critical to being able to, in essence, operate as a business, particularly one that's multinational, like PUMA. Are there any other key elements that you would mention in terms of like the importance of trade compliance at a company that does operate across borders?
I think beyond the cost saving, the aspect of the cost saving, which is, I think, a point that every company should think about, there is, of course, the compliance to the regulations and the legal framework to the international trade, because of course, it avoids the penalties, all of them, and the access to the global markets. This is of major importance to all international companies doing business out there. The risk mitigation is one of them, and I think this is crucial today in still a globalized world, we can say, with everything going on, but it is a globalized world. And this offers also competitiveness in the market, because if you get to these markets and if you get without the penalties, without all these damages to your supply chain, of course, it is competitive. I think another very important thing is also playing around or being able to do something with what the law allows you. I'm giving an example very specific to the fashion industry, but if you know how to classify goods and you know the rules of classification, you can tweak a bit your product. One of these things that we do in the fashion industry is called the duty engineering. So an example with footwear, the upper can be, of course, of leather or textile, and they have different duty rates, very different duty rates, for example, in the US. If you know how to classify and the rules of classification for when an upper is classified as leather and when it is textile. If you change a bit and your leather upper is 50%, if your upper is sometimes 50% and 50% textile, you need to change a bit so that it's a bit more textile or a bit more leather. So you change the duty. So it's considered.
So that the trade compliance aspect can even have an effect on the actual product.
It can. It will change the product, right? If you know how to change and classify correctly, you can change your product as well so that it benefits from a better product. And this plays also a bit into what we call also the recycling. So today we're talking so much about sustainability. So how to use recycled products as well in there and make it a benefit also on the duties. So there's a lot of things also on the product that you can do by using classification. Another thing is on your clearance process. If you know the rules, if you have your entire data online, if you manage that correctly, your clearance process will be much smoother than if you don't. So it's also the aspect of having it faster. And again, when we talked a bit about protectionism, but this is a big deal today. If you know the rules up front, you don't get you don't have the risk of having your products stuck at border, because today you have so many things. You have anti-dumping, you have safeguards, and you have the technical barriers to trade, what we call, which are stamps and standards that your products need to have in order to enter a certain market. And this is super important. If you don't have them, they just don't go into the market. So these are just a few of the examples I can think of right now.
And around protectionism, so, you know, there's obviously, as you said, we're in a globalized world, but you kind of hesitated when you talked about it because we've seen a big rise in protectionism. You know, you have Donald Trump coming up. You have like the tensions between China and the US. Can you, and you talked about trade wars before, can you give us a bit of an idea of what's happening broadly in the world around that? Like what's the current dynamic and what effect it has with the movement of goods and in trade compliance?
I think that we need to think of trade or the world as it's a wave. It comes and goes, right? We had before the globalization, we had era or some years where it was everything one on its own. So we had each country doing business on its own. And this was the way of doing business before. And then we had the boom of globalization, where all the free trade agreements came and everyone was talking about globalization. And there was this big idea of let's do more trade and emphasize this free trade and try to make it all happen amongst all the countries. And this went up. Now we're going again down where the countries are starting. So it's all a wave now, and we're going down again where the countries are trying to protect themselves, or they're not themselves, but the national industries. And this is the protectionism that we're talking about, where they're going back to saying, no, my national industry need to be protected from the outside, right? So this is again limiting the international trade or imposing some type of restrictions that we say on the imports. And this was clear with the US-China trade war, with the tariffs, the Tariff 301 that US imposed against China. And we have lots of these type of protectionism.
What does Tariff 301 mean exactly?
This is the extra tariff. Tariff 301 in the US is the trade barrier to trade. So it's the extra tariff against that the US has on top of the regular duties. It's just the extra tariff.
Okay.
In the US, it is in this case specifically against some products from China, And these were the lists back in 2018, the list A, then B, and so on. And you have the same thing they're not called 301, this is specifically to China, but you have anti-dumping duties in Brazil against footwear from China. So I'm talking again in the fashion industry, right? In Brazil, you have anti-dumping duties for footwear from China. In Argentina, you have anti-dumping duties for footwear from China.
Which, by the way, dumping means bringing in a product that's cheaper than like the market average kind of thing.
Exactly.
Right?
It's one type of it's one way to prevent those specific goods to come in the country, but this is an international term that is also it's in the WTO, right? It's the regulation of anti-dumping. So this is another type, and you can read about the anti-dumping, and this is regulated by the World Trade Organization. So this is a different type of barrier, let's say, a barrier to trade. And it's the technical barrier to trade, which is in the WTO. We have the anti-dumping, you have the safeguard. So there are some that are internationally regulated, and those are the ones that are being followed in Latin America. You have the safeguard measures today in Indonesia against apparel. Yeah. And the difference between these two, mainly, there are lots of differences, but the main one is the anti-dumping is against one country in particular. Mm-hmm. So Brazil and Argentina and Peru, they have it against footwear from China. Mm. Safeguard measure is against all imports from all countries. So that's basically the difference. But it's a protectionism that is happening today. It's a tendency. And the other type is a technical barrier that we call, where the countries say, well, I have a certain standard of all the products that are in my country, and I want them all the products that come in or even that are in the market in this country need to meet these standards. What we say is that also the international organizations say is, well, we should have international standards so that they all have the same. But sometimes the countries say, no, I have a different standard. So this is a bit of a way of saying, now you need to, only for my market, you need to comply to a specific standard. So this is a way of doing a bit of a barrier, because the factories and the global markets, the global companies, they need to do something specific only for that country. And that is, again, a way of doing a barrier to this.
And all these regulations sound like they make your job a lot more interesting and a lot more difficult as well, no?
They certainly do, yes.
They add a little spice to your life, let's just say. So, speaking of adding spice to your work life, given what you've shared with us around how trade compliance works, particularly at a large multinational like PUMA, I'm curious to hear about, in your role, how you work across the different functions in the organization, and also how, and you've already started to allude to it as well, with like working with government entities as well. I mean, I imagine here in Europe with the EU, it's a fascinating space to be in.
Yeah. So to your first point, yes, I think one of the main issues, or one of the major things in trade compliance, is working cross-function. We have to, in order to understand the role and understand the company, you have to work with other functions. There's no other way of understanding the company and of doing your job if you don't work with other areas. We need to work with legal. Even being a lawyer, I don't sit in legal, so I don't have access to all the agreements and everything if I don't work together with legal. I need to work with tax. I need to work with the product developer. I need to understand the product. I need to go to the factory. I need to see how it's done. I need to know if they really understand the rules of origin, if they know. I need to go with work with sourcing to tell them what are the free trade agreements, where is it better to place the goods depending on the exporting country, the importing country. So there's a lot of functions we work together. IT, we need to translate to IT what we need, what type of data I need. When we do the rollout of SAP to brokers and to the company, there are requirements that I need or that need to be there for trade that we need to translate to IT. So there's a lot of things that come from the system. Logistics. I sit in logistics today, and this is
which is not always the case in trade compliance.
It's not always the case, definitely not. In other companies, I used to sit in different areas, but logistics is also one of a big partner of trade. Finance is one of my today is one of my big partners also, to explain to them where are these costs coming from, where are the duties, which one is recoverable, which is not. So there's a lot of people involved.
Yeah, by necessity, it sounds like you have to have a general management mindset when it comes to trade compliance, because you touch so many of the different functions.
Exactly.
It's essential for doing your job.
Correct. And you need to talk to them, understand what they do, and then work with them. That there is no other way of doing a job, I think. And to your point of government, I think this is a very nice and tricky at the same time. If you do the lobbying part, it's really nice. Working with the EU, I like it. Personally, I think it's a very nice part of my job, the lobbying, because you get to see the drafts of the new regulations up front. You can tell them as an industry. PUMA does it as an industry, not on its own. But we get to work together to say what are the good parts, how can it benefit the industry, how it should be done, why is it important. So we get to have very good discussions with the EU in particular, which is the one we do the most, but also with other governments, on why some new regulations are important, or why the anti-dumping in Brazil. We were part of the anti-dumping process, and today the anti-dumping is not against all the producers in China, but 10 producers are out, or 14, I don't remember now. But this was a very big process that we had, and it was part of a process that our industry did. And this is also part of lobbying. And we could explain to them it was a legal procedure still, but it was through our federation that it could happen. So I think these activities are very important, and we get the opportunity to have this exchange with the government and to the people who really do the law, to bring to them the reality of the operation that sometimes they lack if we don't bring to them. And on the other hand, we get to know what are their thoughts and give them some arguments so that they understand it better, why we're bringing that to them. Mm-hmm. This is really nice.
And with all the experience that you bring in trade compliance and customs, Bruna, especially having worked as a consultant at the beginning, what do you think are the major pitfalls that a company can have when it comes to trade compliance, to approaching trade compliance? Like, what are the major mistakes you've seen happen in this area, or structurally, what's the bad approach to it?
I think it's still some companies still do not really understand how vast it is, and how much trade compliance should be involved in the beginning, or in some of the projects. And I'm not talking about PUMA now, I'm talking in general, the things I've seen. Very few companies put trade compliance in the beginning of projects so that we can be part of the entire preparation of a project. And this would help a lot, because when you have a new setup or a new structure being thought of in the beginning, I think it's essential to have someone from trade to tell them exactly what we were talking about. Hey, if you're thinking of a production there, then this should be considered. These regulations, international regulations, should be considered if the product is being thought of being sent to this and this and this market. The regulatory frameworks about these importing markets are this and this and this, and the costs of the importation in these markets are this. You can change the product by doing this and this and this, if I think about the classification already up front. So there are a lot of things that could and should be considered up front if we're also involved up front. And most companies still do not really understand how deep trade compliance can go in these operations. And that's where we lose a lot. And sometimes we are involved only when the operation already starts or is about to start, and then we need to run with a lot of things. It's just, we say, well, but this should have been done before, or we don't have time, or then we need to stay until night doing stuff. And sometimes we just miss things that it could have been an opportunity.
So, Bruna, as somebody who's worked in this field as long as you have, and you've been able to see, again, some of the benefits, but also in terms of some of the pitfalls that companies would want to avoid. What do you enjoy the most around working in trade compliance?
I love working with people. I'm a lawyer, and it sounds crazy, but I love reading the regulations and understanding the entire thing.
It does sound crazy.
I really like understanding it, and sometimes I get really mad at some regulations because I don't like the way it is, but that's something I need to deal with. But I like to understand how it works, and I really like working with people, and I like working with the different aspects of the countries, the international framework. I like to understand, well, how can it be that the international thing works so well, that you have this? I always, already at university, I was always fascinated how things can start somehow internationally with an idea and then cascade down to national governments and still make sense. And this, to me, is something that fascinates still today about trade, that things can move around globally, and they all have, it works. It makes sense from a global perspective. Things move around globally, and someone in New Zealand can still communicate with US, and it makes sense. You can have one good in New Zealand and it has the same classification, or should have, in US, and they talk to each other. And this fascinates me in trade compliance, that you have same rules, or you should have. No, it's always the should, but you should have the same rules applying to one thing in one side of the world and the other side, and that they follow the same logic. And this is crazy about trade.
It's a very interesting aspect, and I think it was good to bring you here, Bruna, to understand more about trade compliance and also to bring it to the forefront, because as we said, I mean, one thing that I was very interested in is the fact, and I remember we talked about this a while ago, but that it can actually affect the product, which if it can affect the product already, how many more things can it affect, right? So it does have a major impact on the company. And that's why there's a lot of consultancies that look after that. Bruna, now looking back at your career, having started studying law and having this very interesting path that you've had, if you had to talk to yourself at the beginning of your career, knowing what you know now, what one piece of advice would you give yourself?
I think one.
This is an actual silence. We haven't broken
only,
down.
Only one. I think
Only one.
Take notes. Take notes of everything and listen. Listen a lot to everyone and take notes, photograph, make pictures of everything you see. Put it down. Put it down. It's not only the laws, but it's also the environment you're in. The laws are important, but the environment, the things you hear are equally important, I think. We read a lot in law, but the environment and the things you hear are equally important. And we tend to focus too much on the paper, and sometimes we forget the environment and what people say, especially when you move to the outside, to the company. And this is something I learned when I I left the legal firm, the consulting, and I came to the industry. I think equally important is to understand the industry you are. It's as important as understanding the law. You need to understand your industry. You need to understand your company. You need to understand the product. You need to understand everything of it. Because if you don't, you cannot do your job right. It takes time. It really takes time because it's completely different from, of course, from the books and the words and the law. But it is very important.
This was Bruna Romano, Global Head of Trade Compliance at PUMA. Efrain, what did you learn about trade compliance? Are you ready to be a diplomat?
Probably not yet, but I'm definitely in a better place of knowledge than I was before our conversation with Bruna. I think I referenced it in the episode that this is something that I've read in textbooks, and I've actually even had to teach when I've taught intro to marketing classes, but Bruna did a great job of really bringing it to life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's interesting how this function, which is not that much spoken about, how much it can affect the working of the company and how multifunctional it is. It affects all the countries where a company operates ultimately. So it's pretty interesting.
It is. And I think, I made a comparison for myself to something like data science or AI, where we don't all have to be experts or data scientists or prompt engineers on the topic, but we have to have some basic foundational understanding of the topic. And I think trade compliance is just like that, in that I think everybody at a company, because it is so wide reaching, has to have some understanding about the topics that Bruna walked us through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and even like when she talked about like trade compliance even affecting the actual sneaker, right? The product and so on. So it's interesting how it must be like a dialogue between departments, and every department, or practically every department, should be minimally aware of it, no?
Absolutely. And I think, she talked about the importance of trade compliance, and, obviously there's the legal ramifications of it that I think we probably all immediately think of when it comes to trade compliance. But the fact that she was talking about, for example, like with the sneaker example, cost savings or competitive advantage through knowledge of what the legal situation actually is, in terms of, like, I think she called it duty engineering, in terms of how they actually manufacture the product itself, is fascinating. Just something that I've never thought of before this discussion with Bruna.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was interesting how you can also link it to sustainability, for example, no, which is obviously a topic that's super important today.
No doubt. I think, as we've said a couple of times now, I think this is a topic that we could all stand to know a little bit more about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Efrain, for accompanying me again today. And thanks also, Bruna. It was a great discussion, learned a lot. And guys, if you're not yet, remember to follow us on LinkedIn. We have, lose count of it sometimes, we have currently 3 video series every week. So on Monday, We have the news of what's relevant in FMCG every week. On Tuesday, we have the Digital Pill with Elisa Poyano. And on Thursday, we have the Social Corner with Raphael Schwartz. And it would be great as well. We've asked you that in the past, but if you could do it again, not again, if you could do it for the first time, it would be great. And leave a comment and a 5-star rating below. That would really help us. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you the next week.